So welcome everyone to poetryEast here at the London Buddhist Centre in Bethnal Green in the UK. I've been in conversation with Dana Gioia. Hopefully by now you've watched my conversation with him about his criticism. I think of Dana as an important and provocative critic, a voice that the poetry world and all of us need to hear. But he's not just a critic, he's primarily a poet. So in this second part of our conversation, we're going to explore his poems, and mostly I'll be asking him to read, obviously, and we'll talk a bit about each of the poems. But yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to just plunge into the poems. So welcome again, Dana. Really good to have you here at Poetry.
We're having fun. It's fun to talk to you.
That's great. That's good. So let's go back to the two forms now. Yes, Dana. So I thought what we'd do is we'd start straight off with you reading. I mean, I've taken the kind of, I've been sort of cheeky enough to select the poems I'm going to ask you to read, which is a bit, I'm aware is a bit cheeky. Anyway, there you go. That's what I've done.
Yeah.
So you're reading the poems that I've asked you to read. So I thought we'd just jump straight in with your poem, Planting the Sequoia. And let's hear that poem, and then we'll talk about that together.
Okay. This is actually from the one book of mine that appeared in the UK, The Gods of Winter, which Peter Loop, the late great Peter Loop Poets published. Now, this is a fairly straightforward poem, but I want to explain a couple of things about it. First of all, when a Sicilian has a child, the first child, the custom is you save the umbilical cord. You wrap the roots of the cord, around the roots of a tree, and you plant it. And the symbolism is fairly obvious. It's a way of rooting yourself to the land that feeds you. Sicilians usually do it with an olive tree or a fig tree. In this case, I am doing it with the great, tree of California, the Sequoia sempervirens, in fact, which these ancient prehistoric trees that still exist out here, and which is not a practical thing to do, to put a redwood tree in, an orchard. I mean, the redwoods that I planted on my property here are, 25 years old, and they're 60 feet tall. The other thing you need to know about this poem is that my wife and I lost our first son. He died at 4 months of what used to be called crib death. It's now called sudden infant death syndrome. We found him simply dead in his crib. The poem is addressed to a you. It's addressed to thing. It's not to the child. It's not to anybody living. I am addressing the tree itself. Planting a sequoia. All afternoon, my brothers and I have worked in the orchard, digging this hole, laying you into it, carefully packing the soil. Rain blackened the horizon, but cold winds kept it over the Pacific, and the sky above us stayed the dull gray of an old year coming to an end. In Sicily, a father plants a tree to celebrate his first son's birth. An olive or a fig tree, a sign that the earth has one more life to bear. I would have done the same, proudly laying new stock into my father's orchard, a green sapling rising among twisted apple boughs, a promise of new fruit in other autumns. But today, we kneel in the cold, planting you, our native giant, defying the practical custom of our fathers, wrapping in your roots a lock of hair, a piece of an infant's birth cord, all that remains above earth of a firstborn son, a few stray atoms brought back to the elements. We will give you what we can, our labor and our soil, water drawn from the earth when the skies fail, nights scented with the ocean fog, days softened by the circuit of bees. We plant you in the corner of the grove, bathed in western light, a slender shoot against the sunset. And when our family is no more, all of his unborn brothers dead, every niece and nephew scattered, the house torn down, his mother's beauty, ashes in the air. I want you to stand among strangers, all young and ephemeral to you, silently keeping the secret of your birth.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you. I wondered.
It's still hard for me to read that poem. I mean, it's,
Yes,
it's,
I bet. And I'm in a way, I'm sorry to pitch you into such tragic matters straight away like that. It seems almost rude, but I wondered whether you could say a little bit more. It's important to me to ask really, but what did that event? How did that affect you? The death of your son and.
well, I mean, first of all, most of my poems aren't autobiographical. I'm not an autobiographical poet generally. This poem, pretty much the poems about my son's death are all autobiographical because one of the great purposes of poetry is to commemorate. As we are mortal, but our imaginations, in a sense, can defy, at least in our own lifetime and through literature, can defy mortality. And that's one of the ancient boasts of poems is that, you will perish, but you will live in this poem. And so I hope that some few atoms of my son live in that poem in the same way that they live in this huge tree that was planted that's still there. When a parent loses a child, especially if it's your only child, it's like a wildfire burning through your life. And I live in a landscape full of wildfires, unfortunately. And when the fire is over, you see what's left standing. And when I lost my son, I realized, I was working. I was paying, my student debts. I was putting my younger brother and sister through college. I was helping my parents who were quite poor. But I realized money didn't really matter much to me. My job didn't matter much to me. My social position mattered not at all to me. That what mattered to me was my family, my work as a writer, and my sense of my own life as a spiritual journey that must move forward rather than simply stay in atrophy in a particular place. And so at that point, it took me a number of years to do this. I began to strip away my life and to strip away my ambitions, my desires, to accept the fact, and I have accepted this in the poetic world. I'm not, in America, I have this weird position. I'm half a hero, half a pariah. The poetry establishment, treats me as if I were, a piece of toxic radium. Average readers, I think, trust me. But it doesn't matter. What matters to me is that I write truthfully, I go as deeply to myself. And this fundamentally, I think, began when I lost my son. When it was with the thing that was most precious to my life was with brutality and suddenness stripped from me. And I realized, essentially, it taught me a brutal lesson in humility and compassion. And I used to go to the graveyard because I'm a working class guy. I needed something to do. So he was buried in this kind of derelict 19th century Catholic cemetery. So I would go there in the evening, not dark, but after work, and I would clean it up because there was broken branches, leaves, all kinds of stuff. And it just became a therapy for me to do this. And I began to meet the other people who came to the cemetery. I never knew these people existed. They were mostly old women who had lost sons. And they would come over and I would talk to them because I knew that if we were both there, there was a reason. The same thing happened when I gave readings. I would read this poem, and afterwards, after everybody else left, there would be a person there. And I would go to them and I'd say, did you lose a child? And they'd say, how did you know? And I'd say, because, and so you develop a radar for compassion. So I would sit down and I would talk to these people because you know what they shared in common besides having lost somebody? Everybody in their lives was tired of talking about it. They wanted these people to move on and everything else, but they needed, in a sense, to have that sorrow acknowledged and that person commemorated. And I began to realize that the importance that this poem and a couple of other poems that I have written is that other people can bring their own sorrows into them. They can inhabit them as a suffering person and not be criticized. Not have somebody say, oh, shut up about that, which is what happens to most of these people. And so anyway, it's a weird thing. When you lose a child, or I guess probably if you lose a spouse, you are given lifetime membership in a club you don't want to join. But if you're going to be in this club, do what the club should do, which in this case is to show compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And recognize the suffering comes to everyone.
I mean, I'd like to, if we had time, I'd get you to read some more of that section from 99 poems, which I'd very, very much recommend anyone to read. But I want to go backwards in time a bit to you as a boy and to your reading, because the matter of reading for you is unusual, and I thought I'd get you to read The Night Watch, and I thought I'd get you to read that and then talk about that as a poem that perhaps introduces that whole part of your life.
This is a poem I almost never read in public, so I hope I do a good job. What needs to be said is this. My mother's family were Mexican. They were brilliant kids. Her mother died when she was a kid. My Mexican grandfather, who was the ex-cowboy, was an alcoholic with an explosive temper. The kids sort of had to raise themselves, and even though they were brilliant, nobody went to college. My uncle, Theodore Ortiz, Ted Ortiz, left school at 15 and lied about his age and joined the U.S. Merchant Marines. And so he spent the rest of his life, as did his two brothers, on these ships during World War II and afterwards. And he was a proletariat intellectual. He would bring boxes of books, he would read, he taught himself languages and things like this. He was killed in a plane crash when I was 6, but our apartment was full of his books. And so I have this relationship with him through the books that he left us and read. I have almost no memory of him, although he shared a room with me. I mean, we were very poor, so it was another bed. So when he was not at sea, he would come back and be in the other bed. And so, this. And so this is about imagining him on the ship doing a night watch when he's the only one on deck. Night watch for my uncle, Theodore Ortiz, U.S. Merchant Marine. I think of you standing on the sloping deck as the freighter pulls away from the coast of China, the last lights of Asia disappearing in the fog, and the engine's drone dissolving in the old monotony of waves slapping up against the hull. Leaning on the rails, looking eastward to America across the empty weeks of ocean, how carefully you must have planned your life. So much of it already wasted on the sea, the vast country of your homelessness. Macau, Vladivostok, Singapore, Dante read by ship lamp on the bridge, the names of fellow sailors lost in war. These memories will die with you. But tonight, they rise up burning in your mind, interweaving like the gulls crying in the wake, like currents on a chart, like gulf weeds swirling in a star-soaked sea, and interchangeable as all the words for night. La notte, noche, nacht, nuit. Each sound half foreign, half familiar, like America. For now, you know that mainland best from dreams, your dead mother turning toward you slowly, always on the edge of words, yet always silent as the suffering Madonna of a shrine, or your father pounding his fist against the wall. There are so many ways to waste a life. Why choose between these icons of unhappiness when there is the undisguised illusion of the sea, the comfort of old books, and solitude to fill the long night watch, the endless argument of waves? Breathe in that dark, intangible air, for in a few weeks you will be dead, burned beyond recognition, left as a headstone in the unfamiliar earth, with no one to ask, neither wife nor children, why your thin ashes have been buried here and not scattered on the shifting gray Pacific.
That's wonderful, Dana. I think that's a wonderful poem. What it brings to me, at least, is the importance still of the war. My father was in the war in Burma, and he used to come. My father was much older than my mother, so he used to come back with all these stories. He came back. I didn't know him then, of course, but even as an old man, he would tell all these stories. And I fear that we'll forget the war, and we'll forget what war does to people. So I don't know. That evocation of your uncle and how that sort of passed into your life just feels very alive.
You're absolutely. I hadn't thought of it in these terms, but he never outlived the war because he was poor and everything else, and so he was trying to find the life after the merchant marine. And he was just about, he was going to take one more, he would have taken one more ship, then he was going to try to get into college. And so, it was, so he was, a late casualty of the war. My father spent VJ Day. People probably don't even, younger than us don't even know what VJ Day was. It was the official end of the war. He was in a hospital. He had been, he was in the Navy Air Force. He was a radio operator. He had crashed, and he was lucky enough to have survived the crash. And so, we were raised under the shadow of people who had fought in the war, who had seen people die, who had lost, 4, 5, 6 years of their lives, and had suffered a kind of silent post-traumatic stress syndrome. And there was, they wasn't really, at least in the United States, you're just supposed to keep your mouth shut about it, And so it was a reality, and that's what I was glad to commemorate my uncle, who was so important for me in his afterlife. But shouldn't we all try to create an afterlife that helps someone?
Yeah, indeed. Let's go to you still, because I'm talking to you there in your home in California, and let's hear California Hills in August. I think this is the first poem you had published in the New Yorker or something like that.
Yeah, it was. It was I was living in New York, and and so I was, and I lived before that. At Harvard. I lived in Boston, and so if you're in New England, you have very English seasons. You have fall when the leaves fall off. You have winter with snow. You've got spring with rains and revival of things. Then you have a big green, lush summer. But as a Californian, these were not my seasons. And my landscape was not the landscape of England or New England, which is to say, was not the landscape of English language poetry. And so what this poem and this poem is actually, weirdly, when I wrote it, I did not think anybody else would understand it. I mean, I honestly didn't. I just thought I wrote it because I wrote it. It actually came to me. One of the few poems that, I was walking through some hills after my father had been in the hospital, and the poem came to me. And so I figured it wasn't any good. It's probably my most famous poem, and it's been translated into all the languages of countries that don't get much rain. So California, hills in August. It imagines how an East Coast person would see California in the summer. And then at the very end, how a native sees it. California, hills in August. I can imagine someone who found these fields unbearable, who climbed the hillside in the heat, cursing the dust, cracking the brittle weeds underfoot, wishing a few more trees for shade. An Easterner especially, who would scorn the meagerness of summer, the dry, twisted shapes of black elm, scrub oak, and chaparral, a landscape August had already drained of green. One who would hurry over the clinging thistle, foxtail, golden poppy, knowing everything was just a weed, unable to conceive that these trees and sparse brown bushes were alive, and hate the bright stillness of the noon, without wind, without motion, the only other living thing, a hawk, hungry for prey, suspended in the blinding sunlit blue. And yet, how gentle it seems to someone raised in a landscape short of rain. The skyline of a hill broken by no more trees than one can count. The grass, the empty sky, the wish for water.
Thank you. Thank you. California.
So, I think one of the things you learn as a poet, that you have this great poetic tradition, you want to be part of it, you want to write your divine comedy, your immortality ode, but your poetry needs to begin in where you are. I mean, I'm very much of a materialist in this sense. You live in a real time, in a real place, in a real body, and that's where creativity begins, rather than, it's pretending you're somewhere else. And I think a lot of bad art is about pretending you're somewhere else, pretending you're in a place that's more poetic. But we find poetry in the actuality of our own lives, our own places.
I want to move on to another poem, because one of the things that, I don't know whether you'd agree with this, but I see you very much in that tradition from Robert Frost. I see echoes sometimes of Richard Wilbur in your work, a poet I very much admire and I think isn't admired enough. But what you're also willing to embrace, you're not just a nature poet, for instance. You're very much willing to embrace all kinds of themes that sort of strike you. So I thought you'd read. I thought I'd ask you to read "Cruising with the Beach Boys." Okay. It seemed to me to be like, I didn't expect the guy who wrote California Hills in August to also write a poem called "Cruising with the Beach Boys."
Well, it's interesting. All 4 poems we read so far are California poems. They're West Coast poems. I am from a working class, ugly urban neighborhood in Los Angeles, a town called Hawthorne. And at the very far end of Hawthorne, there's a, lower middle class. It goes from working class to lower middle class. And that's where the Beach Boys were raised. And in fact, my uncle, Giacomo, who was a carpenter, came back one day. He says, I had the stupidest customer I've ever had. This idiot wanted me to tear up his living room floor to make a sandbox. And so I ripped our carpet up. We made a sandbox. We brought sand in. So I can't understand this guy. And he said, well, what does he do? He was a musician. It was Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. Boys, whom I never met, but I mean, he was, but it was interesting. I have that 1 degree of separation between, my uncle Giacomo, who lived next door in the apartment. We were all in apartments, and him. So what this is, there's a wonderful line from Noel Coward's Private Lives, where they hear the very sophisticated couple hear this song, it's their song, and they're being British of a certain class and generation. They're embarrassed by their own emotions. And so the Noel Coward character says, "How strangely potent cheap music is." This is a poem about how strangely potent cheap music is, which is to say, these old songs that we hear have the power years later to bring us back to who we were and where we were when we first heard them. And this is about being on a trip somewhere in a car, hearing a Beach Boys song. Cruising with the Beach Boys. So strange to hear that song again tonight, traveling on business in a rented car, miles from anywhere I've been before. And now a tune I haven't heard for years. Probably not since it last left the charts back in LA in 1969. I can't believe I know the words by heart and can't think of a girl to blame them on. Every love-sick summer has its song, and this one I pretended to despise. But if I were alone when it came on, I turned it up full blast to sing along. A primal scream in croaky baritone, the notes all flat, the lyrics mostly slurred. No wonder I spent so much time alone, making the rounds in Dad's old Thunderbird. Some nights I drove down to the beach to park and walk along the railings of the pier. The water down below was cold and dark, the waves monotonous against the shore. The darkness and the mist, the midnight sea, the flickering lights reflected from the city. A perfect setting for a boy like me. The Cecil B. DeMille of my self-pity. I thought by now I'd left those nights behind, lost like the girls that I could never get, gone with the years, junked with the old T-bird. But one old song, a stretch of empty road, can open up a door and let them fall, tumbling like boxes from a dusty shelf, tightening my throat for no reason at all, bringing on tears, shed only for myself.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dana.
I don't think everybody today knows who Cecil B. DeMille was, but Cecil B. DeMille was the maker of huge epic films, 10 Commandments and things like this. And so,
I mean,
it's a funny poem because it's been translated into other languages because they like the Beach Boys, but cruising with the Beach Boys. I mean, cruising is where you get in a car and you drive up and down the boulevard. If you've seen American Graffiti, you know what cruising is, a very Californian thing. My Italian translator translated un viaggio con I Beach Boys, which means cruising in a ship with the Beach Boys. And I said, no, it doesn't mean that. And so I explained to him what it meant, and he goes, non exista in Italia. So anyway, we came up with in giro, which is where the people walk around the court, the plaza, and the guys and girls check each other out.
So one of the striking things about that, of course, and it's something I want to bring in is the formal values of the poem. It's about the Beach Boys. What I like about it as well is its honesty. It is actually the sort of thing that you pretend you get it exactly right, isn't it? We have ABBA here. It used to be ABBA for my generation. That nobody admitted they liked ABBA. I don't know who bought their singles, but I never met anybody who did. But of course, all of my generation now sings them just like that.
Well, the funny thing is that when I was in high school, no intellectual could possibly have admitted they liked the Beach Boys. It was a love that dare not speak its name. And so, and I think a lot of pop music is that way. you know the poem, the songs you're allowed to like, but the things that really get, go right to your heart are somewhat different. How strangely potent cheap music is. I mean, Noel Coward said.
But what one of the things that you work in a lot is form. So that's a poem in pentameter and rhyme. And we're going to come on to ones which use form even more tightly. One of your achievements seems to be to be using form. Could you say a little bit about? Because people are quite snidey about rhythm and particularly rhyme, audible rhyme now.
If you don't have form, you don't have poetry, period. I really believe that. Now, about a third or more of my poems are in free verse, but you have to treat free verse as a form. You shape it, because what you're trying to do is to take, 100 words of meaning and turn them into 10 syllables of meaning. You're trying to, in a sense, intensify language to raise language to the level of song. And you do it in free verse in one way, you do it in rhyme and meter. So I am open to working in any shape the muse suggests, but you've got to tune it. You've got to make sure that you're tuned your instrument up so you can hit the high notes and the low notes. So now came to maturity at a point where it was quite literally forbidden for serious young poets to write in form. You were mocked, you were attacked. And one of the ways I became famous is I was attacked so frequently for writing in form. And it was elitist, it was European, it was British, it was retrograde, and it was undemocratic, un-American, in fact. Diane Wachowski condemned Robert Frost as being un-American because he wrote in rhyme and meter. So I'm saying, well, if your definition of American poetry excludes Robert Frost, where are you? It makes no sense. But this is the ideological things people get into. I mean, this was delete culture, before delete culture. But my point was that I was raised among uneducated working class people who liked poetry, and they liked the music of poetry. When I thought of the poems that I liked, I mean, they could be, by fashionable poets like Wallace Stevens. Beauty is momentary in the mind, a fitful tracing of a portal, but in the flesh it is immortal. The body dies, the body, and I loved that. I loved E.E. Cummings. I loved a poet who was unspeakable at that point. You couldn't possibly admit to liking her. Edna St. Vincent Millay. I liked the music of Eliot. I liked the free music, the free verse music of Pound, and so I didn't quite understand the notion of enchantment there, but intuitively I knew that the poem had to get you by the sound, by the tune, by the physical rhythm of the words, and it had to appeal to your body, not just your intellect. And so I began doing this not out of any ideology, but out of intuition, out of love. I loved the music that I heard, and I wanted to make music like I was like somebody with a garage band. I liked this band, and I wanted to, hit my drums and play my guitar and make something comparable. And the critics did not like it, and so I was attacked. But interestingly, a whole group of poets began to form, began to form around the 3 or 4 people that were sort of in the public's eye as targets. And then we were announced to have formed a movement. We formed a movement with people we had never met. For the most part, the New Formalists. Hey, I hate the name. I don't. I think it's. But what I believe is that. Poetry is the sister art to song, and that a poem are words which are raised to the emotional, physical intensity that we experience in song. You do it differently in a poem, but there's a lot of similarity. And if you just look at the lyrics of songs, and you'll see the genetic, resemblance between the art forms.
Indeed.
And actually, I've gone on to write opera libretti, and I've gone on to write song lyrics.
Yes, indeed. So we're going to come on to one of those songs from libretti in a minute. But I thought I'd get you to read Alley Cat Love Song. Because again, I wanted to sort of show the different sides of Dana Gioia as well, because there's so many different sort of tonalities, and this sort of follows on nicely from what we've just been saying about form and song.
Well, this is a parody. Obviously, it's a parody, of one of my favorite poets, Tennyson. Who goes, "Come into the garden, Maud, for the black bat night has flown." And I had a friend of mine who had a superannuated tomcat, and his name was Fred. And she decided to brighten up the twilight years of Fred by bringing him home a child bride. And it became a very unusual May-December marriage because the young cat was smitten by Fred. Every month she would go into heat and pursue Fred around the house and garden, but it was a little too late in December for Fred to reciprocate, so nothing ever happened. So I wrote the young cat this poem. Come into the garden, Fred, for the neighborhood tabby is gone. Come into the garden, Fred. I have nothing but my flea collar on, and the scent of the catnip has gone to my head. I'll wait by the screen door till dawn. The fireflies court in the sweet gum tree, and a night jar calls from the pine, and she seems to say in her rhapsody, "Oh, mustard brown Fred, be mine." And the full moon sets my whiskers afire, and the fur goes erect on my spine. I hear the frogs in the muddy lake croaking from shore to shore. They've one swift season to soothe their ache. In autumn, they sing no more. So ignore me now, and you'll hear my meow as I scratch all night by the door.
That's great.
And so, it's a poem that's a fun poem. I think it expresses a different sort of human truth. More than a few people have told me that it describes them, them in various moods. But anyway, and poor Fred has gone to the great, cat cemetery in the sky, and I'm glad he's remembered, along with his child bride.
Right. So what you were saying, you've written opera libretti. So I thought we'd hear one of those, Nosferatu Serenade. It might be just lovely if you could say a little bit about writing libretti.
I've written 4 opera libretti for 3 different composers. The first one was based on the very famous film by F.W. Murnau, Nosferatu. Now, if you know anything about the history of Nosferatu, interestingly, the screenplay was written in verse by Murnau, but Murnau had wanted to film a British novel or Irish novel called Dracula by Abraham Stoker, but he couldn't get the rights. So, doing what great filmmakers have always done, if you can't get the rights, well, you plagiarize. So he essentially took the bones of Bram Stoker's famous novel, but he, I think, improved it. Because Stoker's novel, to a certain degree, is a supernatural thriller. It's an adventure novel of the fearless vampire hunters. And what Murnau did was to essentially take the elements of Stoker and overlay Wagner and German Romanticism onto it. And I think he created an altogether more interesting work of art. And I happened to see the uncut version of Nosferatu, which is almost never shown. And the 40 minutes that's cut out is all about the heroine. It's about Ellen. And you realize that the film is not so much about a vampire as it is about a woman who is trapped by society, by marriage, by people's perception of her own sort of mental instability into a tragic situation of which the vampire is merely the catalyst. And I saw that, I said, gee, this is just like a bel canto opera. This is like Lucia di Lammermoor or La Sonnambula or I Puritani. And I was being asked to write a libretto, so I pitched it to the composer, who was reluctant until I explained to him, that, and he and I both know that opera is about the suffering of people with high voices. And so we began to write it, but one of the key scenes is where about 2/3 of the way into the opera, into the film, the vampire and his ultimate victim, his chosen bride, meet, not even face to face yet, but they're now in physical proximity, and she can, as it were, hear him. And so she has to come to him willingly. So the question is, how does a vampire plausibly seduce someone? What is the argument you make to come to love me? And the argument was, and I think this is an argument that's made every day in the United States, in England, all over the world. And this is the argument. You are unhappy. You have been different from other people your whole life. You have shameful things inside you. You have darkness inside you that you're trying to deny, that cut you off from other people. I come to you to acknowledge that darkness, that pain, that isolation. That is what I bring to you. And so you will, for the first time, in a sense, know that someone shares that dangerous darkness. And that's the argument he makes. Nosferatu Serenade. I am the image that darkens your glass, the shadow that falls wherever you pass. I am the dream you cannot forget, the face you remember without having met. I am the truth that must not be spoken, the midnight vow that cannot be broken. I am the bell that tolls out the hours. I am the fire that warms and devours. I am the hunger that you have denied, the ache of desire piercing your side. I am the sin you have never confessed, the forbidden hand caressing your breast. You've heard me inside you speak in your dreams, sigh in the ocean, whisper in streams. I am the future you crave and you fear. You know what I bring. Now I am here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, when I began writing opera libretti, I had to learn something that was fundamental about poetic drama. Because I was used to writing poems, on the page, poems to be heard when they're read aloud. But when you're writing for opera, when you're writing for the stage, when you're writing a song, you also have to give the singer, the speaker, words that they can inhabit as their own life. They have to, saying those words, know who they are, what they want, where they came from, and where they are going. And that's a different sort of thing. And so, I've been very conscious of that, is to make the singer become the poem, become the lyrics and the music. And curiously, that's come back into my own poetry, which has also made me take the reader more sensitively. Can I actually give an example of this? It's probably not a poem that you want me to read. It's not a poem I actually ever read much. If I can just take one, it's, if I can find it here, but it's an example of this. This is a poem, what's it called? It's called Reunion. It's on page 163 of this. I wrote this poem. It's the most banal inspiration you could possibly meet. I went to my college reunion at Stanford because a beautiful girl that I've been in love with as an undergraduate said, well, you have to come, and I want you to meet my husband and my kids and everything. So I went, and I realized I didn't know anybody there. It was, and even if I did, I didn't recognize them. And so I came back and I started to write a poem, but the poem became something that had nothing to do really with the reunion. It's about the sense of strangeness that we feel in the world. And I want to just I don't know if you like this poem or not, but I'm not sure if I like this poem or not, but it's fairly short. It's a friend of mine said, "Oh, I love this poem. It's my favorite kind of poem of yours, a Twilight Zone poem." So it's okay. Reunion. This is your past where no one knows me. These are your friends whom I can't name. Here in a field where no one chose me. The face is older, the voice is the same. Why does the stranger rise to greet me? What is the joke that makes him smile as he calls his children together to meet me, bringing them forward in single file? I nod, pretending to recognize them, not knowing exactly what I should say. Why does my presence seem to surprise them? Who is the woman who turns away? Is this my home or an illusion? The bread on the table smells achingly real. Must I at last solve my confusion? Or is confusion all I can feel? Now, I gave a reading, and this woman that I knew 40 years earlier came up to me, lovely, lovely woman. I hadn't seen her for 40 years. And she brought a framed copy of this poem. And she says, this poem is so important to me. I'm flattered. What poet wouldn't be flattered when this beautiful, woman tells him this? And then she takes the poem around, she turns it around, and it's a picture of a man, an older man. And she says, my father has Alzheimer's. And this is a poem that helped me understand how he must feel every day. Now, my poem was not about Alzheimer's, but now it is. Her reading of the poem was as good as mine, because I realized what I'd done is create a vessel for meaning in which people could bring things of importance to themselves, the confusions of their own, and seek clarity. So anyway, but that's what I mean about creating a space for others to inhabit. Because the poem has meaning to me, but it's a very different kind of meaning. But I don't see the two meanings as at all incompatible. Okay, now you can go back to the list that you had. Sorry to interrupt there.
I wanted to, whilst we're on meaning, I wanted to sort of start to touch on some of your poems that talk really very much about. Well, for me, talk about your faith. I thought I'd get you to read "The Angel and the Was it "The Angel with the Broken Wing"? I mean, there's so many poems in this that I'm struck by, but that was another one.
Well, if you go, go to museums, and you go to that aren't contemporary museums, you realize that most of the work that you're seeing is work, that has had religious significance. It's a Buddha, it's a Madonna, it's these beautiful works of art that were created for worship or for meditation or to create a spirit of sanctity. And they have been taken out of that context and they have become objects of aesthetic contemplation. And indeed, they are magnificent objects of aesthetic contemplation, but they are in a different context than that which they were originally created and experienced. And so it's about this. And I'd have to get up and show you, I love these works of art that were created in the American Southwest, in Central America. They had churches, they had family shrines, but they couldn't import work from Europe. So these native wood carvers, would carve these statues. They're called santos, saints. So even Christ is a santo, and they had all these local saints and these local legends, and they would have them. And they are now, in museums. People don't know, they're all anonymous. They were carved by people that didn't sign their names. And occasionally they're very fragile, so they're occasionally broken. So this is a poem spoken by a statue in a museum. It's a santo. It's a Mexican statue of an angel, and it's missing a wing. And it is survived. Actually, I can sort of show you one. Hold on, I'll introduce you to Saint Sebastian. He is a Mexican statue. Now notice his arms, have been torn off and pasted back. Notice that he's been cracked in various places. Saint Sebastian is a santo. And during the Mexican Revolution, when all of the churches were vandalized and shut, he was chopped into pieces. Somebody took those pieces and hid them, and then years later put him back together. And I love him because he's beautiful, and he also reminds me of how I feel a lot of times when life has chopped me into pieces. So I'm going to lay Saint Sebastian down here for a second. My cat, the arrows I think are a later thing. My cat used to knock the arrows out, so Saint Sebastian's indignities have not stopped. So this is spoken by a santo that's been, vandalized in the Mexican Revolution. The angel with the broken wing. I am the angel with the broken wing, the one large statue in this quiet room. The staff finds me too fierce, and so they shut faith's ardor in this air-conditioned room. The docents praise my elegant design above the chatter of the galleries. Perhaps I am a masterpiece of sorts, the perfect emblem of futility. Mendoza carved me for a country church. His name's forgotten now, except by me. I stood beside a gilded altar where the hopeless offered God their misery. I heard their women whispering at my feet, prayers for the lost, the dying, and the dead. Their candles stretched my shadows up the wall, and I became the hunger that they fed. I broke my left wing in the revolution. Even a saint can savor irony. When troops were sent to vandalize the chapel, they hit me once, almost apologetically, for even the godless feel something in a church, a twinge of hope, fear, who knows what it is, a trembling unaccounted by their laws, an ancient memory they can't dismiss. There are so many things I must tell God. The howling of the damned can't reach so high, but I stand like a dead thing nailed to a perch, a crippled saint against a painted sky.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we'll probably need to move on a bit more, but I want to go on again to this poem, Guide to the Other Gallery, while we're in galleries, and yeah, touching again on your own faith, Dana.
Well, this is yeah. I don't know where I have it in here. I think it's this is a very weird poem. I'll tell you once again, it had a banal origin. There is a museum in Rome that consists almost entirely of the pieces of other statues they haven't been able to put together. So you have feet, you've got hands, you've got, noses, you've got heads. And I was, then I had that memory. Then I went to a mad woman's museum in rural Alabama. She had all these barns that were full of like all this stuff she'd done. In fact, I wrote a long poem called Counting the Children, which was made into actually a piece of dance theater, which is kind of also inspired by that. But I just thought of these great weird museums of things people can't throw away. And so it's being given a guide. I don't know what meaning it has to. I can tell you at the end who I think is speaking and who he's speaking to, but but I won't do that before you hear it. Guide to the other gallery. This is the hall of broken limbs, where splintered marble athletes lie beside the arms of cherubim. Nothing is ever thrown away. These butterflies are set in rows, so small and gray inside their case. They look alike now. I suppose death makes most things commonplace. These portraits here of the unknown are hung three high, frame piled on frame, each potent soul who craved renown, immortalized without a name. Here are the shelves of unread books, millions of pages turning brown. Visitors wander through the stacks, but no one ever takes one down. I wish I were a better guide. There's so much more that you should see. Rows of bottles with nothing inside, displays of locks which have no key. You'd like to go? I wish you could. The room has such a peaceful view. Look at this case of antique wood without a label. It's for you.
That's great.
So, it's anyway, I guess that would qualify as one of my Twilight Zone poems. But it's, when I was writing and I thought of this as the devil or a devil in hell, leading you to your particularly eternal and meaningless destination.
So I thought we'd have finished with three more sort of shorter poems. Firstly, Marriage of Many Years. Lovely to have a poem about the marriage of many years. There's a set of, in 99 poems, your new and selected poems, there's a whole set of love poems, really. And I thought you might read Marriage of Many Years.
Be happy to. There aren't a lot of good love poems about a happy marriage. I mean, it's sort of interesting. There's lots of poems about an unhappy marriage, about unhappy relationships. And I think it's for two reasons. I think, it's easier to be more dramatic and more emotional about sad things and about pain. But I think the real reason is that it's very difficult to talk about what makes an enduring love special. And I was thinking about, once again, in California, there are a few Indian tribes of which there are only one or two or three native speakers. And when those people die, the language is lost, the songs, the tribal dances all vanish as if they were never there. Now, does that mean that those cultures had no value? No, it simply meant that they were, like all cultures, mortal, just more visibly so when we catch them at the moment of their extinction. And it occurred to me that a marriage is like this, that when you're in love with a person for a long, long time, when you live together, the two of you form a private language. And that language, which is both words and expressions and touch, is the most intimate form of communication you'll ever have with another human being. And so I wrote this poem for my wife. It's called Marriage of Many Years. Most of what happens beyond words. The lexicon of lip and fingertip defies translation into common speech. I recognize the musk of your dark hair. It always thrills me, though I can't describe it. My finger on your thigh does not touch skin. It touches your skin, warming to my touch. You are a language I have learned by heart. This intimate patois will vanish with us. It's only native speakers. Does it matter? Our tribal chants, our dances round the fire performed the sorcery we most required. They bound us in a spell time could not break. Let the young vaunt their ecstasy. We keep our tribe of two in sovereign secrecy. What must be lost was never lost on us.
That's great. Thank you. I know that's really great. And yeah, let's have two more to finish. Let's hear this wonderful short poem that you wrote, Unsaid, which strikes me as a classic poem. It's one of those poems that must have been the devil to write. I don't know. People don't realize, do they, with poetry, that it's the simplest ones that are the hardest. You know, people think that writing complex things with difficult subject matters and elaborate syntax and talking about, you know, some kind of strange, you know, African beetle in great detail, you think that those are the hard poems. What the hardest poems are ones that rhyme A B and are in tetrameter and so on.
This is a poem that's 6 lines long. It originally was 36 lines long, and really about a different subject. And as I kept rewriting and condensing, and went from 36 to 32 to 24 to 20 to 16. It never stopped at 14, so it never had a chance of being a sonnet. It finally was about 8 lines long, and I realized it was too wordy, and so I cut it down. And it's now about something that emerged in the process of writing the poem that was not part of it. And it's really about most of who we are, most of what we think, most of what we feel is inside us. And even the people closest to us in the world don't fully know what we experience, what we think. You know, our lives pass mostly unsaid. And so it's about this. Unsaid. So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. Think of the letters that we write our dead.
Wonderful. And finally, I thought I just couldn't resist. I mean, I love this poem, the next poem, and this seemed exactly the right place to finish our conversation, to finish at least beginning to listen to your poetry, Dana. I just thought let's finish with the next poem.
Okay, yeah, it's a, where is it in here? See, most of my poems I know by heart, but what happens is there's always some phrase I forget. And so if I have the book open, it's, in fact, I know the poems by heart, not because I memorize them, but because when I compose them out loud. And, in the marriage of many years, I do something I often do. I remember an earlier draft. I recited it well today, but I have the phrase "in sovereign secrecy," about marriage. And my first draft, it was just in solemn secrecy. Not anywhere nearly as good a line. I mean, it's solemn secrecy, but in sovereign secrecy. But sometimes I'll substitute that. So anyway, the next poem is about the experience of being a writer. When you write a new poem, you are absolutely convinced it's the greatest poem in the world. Posterity will tremble before its greatness. Then when you start to revise it or you read it later, you realize, well, it's not quite as good as you thought it was. But what keeps you going as a poet is the assurance that your next poem is going to be the great one. And so I've decided to explain, to describe my next poem. The next poem. How much better it seems now than when it is finally done. The unforgettable first line, the cunning way the stanzas run, the rhymes, soft-spoken and suggestive, are barely audible at first, an appetite not yet acknowledged, like the inkling of a thirst, while gradually the form appears, as each line is coaxed aloud, the architecture of a room, seen from the middle of a crowd. The music, that of common speech, but slanted so that each detail sounds unexpected as a sharp inserted in a simple scale. No jumbled box of imagery dumped glumly on the reader's lap, or elegantly packaged junk the unsuspecting must unwrap, but words that could direct a friend precisely to an unknown place, those few unshakable details that no confusion can erase, and the real subject left unspoken, but unmistakable to those who don't expect a jungle parrot in the black and white of prose. How much better it seems now than when it is finally written. How hungrily one waits to feel the bright lure seized, the old hook bitten.
That's great. Thank you very much.
I want to right an ancient wrong that the TLS did me, where the critic, who seems to be unaware that there are differences between American and British English, criticized the poem by saying that place and erase were not a perfect rhyme. And I guess they aren't in British English, but let me tell you something. In California, they sound just fine.
Well, having righted that wrong, I want to thank you very much for both, talking about the poems, hearing you read the poems, all of your critical work that we've only just really touched on. There's so much there. Thank you very much for zooming into poetry. It's really, really lovely to meet you, Dana.
I'm delighted to, and especially because I don't have a publisher in Britain. Gods of Winter came out. It was a poetry books, society selection. It went through a couple of printings, and then because Peterloo went bankrupt, and I promised, them, Harry Chambers, my future books, because he took a chance on me, and I felt that was the way to do. I've never had a publisher there, so this brings me back in touch with at least the few readers I have in the United Kingdom, and I thank them all. So, and what a pleasure to meet you. If nothing else, we had fun today.
Yeah, indeed, that's the main thing. So really nice to meet you, Dana, and hope to see you in the flesh one day.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.